etching made in 80s called Little White Dog. It has the size of a matchbox, very small thing, and sometimes I think it's the most harmless thing I ever made. So after graduating from the school, there was an important moment in my life. This was in Soviet times, very different from now. I think you all heard about Soviet Union, where I was born. It was completely different society, different politics, everything was different. And the important thing for a young architect was that it was not possible or too difficult to be at least a little bit independent as an architect. It was not possible to have private bureau, private office. Architecture was totally controlled by the state, and to be an architect, it was meaning to be a little part of a huge machine, to go to the big official office. There were a number of them in Moscow, and that was a choice, that was a decision that we had to make. I was working at that time in collaboration with a friend of mine, Ilya Utkin. We studied together, and we had to decide what is more important for us, to build or to be independent. And the decision was fast, and we preferred to stay independent, be artists, and not to build and wait until the possibility to build something maybe very small, but what we can call our work. So for more than 20 years we did art. We worked together, then started working separately. And the most important in this period, that was 80s, was what now is called paper architecture. So actually it was a series of Japanese, mostly Japanese, but foreign, Western conceptual architectural competitions that were strictly prohibited. Before that, we couldn't take part. We knew about these competitions, but was not allowed for us to show our works in the West. And then in the early 80s it became possible, and a big group of young architects started making these proposals for the competitions. We made many of them, and we're so lucky to win some of these competitions. And that was later called the paper architecture movement. So it was conceptual architectural projects, not to be built, but just to represent some ideas. So I'll show you a selection of these projects. They all were made as technically as etchings, because we were really very much inspired by works of Piranesi. That was and still is the favorite, one of the very favorite artists and architects. So we wanted to make etchings, and we learned this technique ourselves, bought the etching press at some moment, and started doing these projects. This was the first one we made, called Crystal Palace. So it's about the mirage, architecture as a mirage. The palace that you can see from the distance, in reality, is just a number of huge glass sheets standing in the sand. So when you come through the city and see the palace, you see that it's not a palace at all, it's almost nothing. So as you can see, it's the stories. I call it kind of architectural fairy tales. We had some architectural idea, we made an image or number of images, and sometimes we used little pieces of literature to illustrate the idea better, little stories. So it was a kind of narrative works. This was a glass chapel in mountains, a chapel as a bridge. Many of these competitions are about glass because all of them are Japanese, organized by the Japanese magazine JA, Japan Architect, and the sponsor was the big glass company, so they wanted to see something about glass. This was the intelligent market in the very beginning of the computer era, the competition about information, and we didn't know much, almost nothing at that moment about the computers, and we said that the only real information that you can get, you get not from the computer but from the conversation with other people. So these people floating in boats trying to read millions of little messages on the columns in the darkness, which is almost impossible. This competition was called the space with an atrium. So it was about the inside yard of a building. And we made a project of a prison. The building, the stone building with no windows and with mirror surface inside. So all the cells, all the rooms have the window that catch the sky. All the prisoners can see only the sky, nothing else. The Bulwark of Resistance, another Japanese competition. I remember that the judge here was Tadao Ando, which was very important for us. He was already a very famous architect at that time. And we got, I think we got the second prize here. So we made a little house in the middle of the street somewhere in the city, looked like New York or Bangkok. And he has two places to live. He has the choice to hide away downstairs or to resist all these terrible cars and modern life, living in the open space. As you can see, he chose the upper level. We made two works for the competition, the Glass Tower. So this was a story about the Glass Tower as a symbol of people's will, people's desire to represent themselves to other people. So this is a huge glass cylinder in the middle of the city, absolutely empty, with one little room in the middle, and one person can climb up to the room. When he is there, his huge image appears in the whole cylinder for a few minutes. So the whole city can see him. Then he goes down and the other one comes up. And the other thing that is opposite is Egyptian pyramid, where tons of stone were used to hide the person, so nobody can ever see him. And this is another version of Glass Tower, the tower that fell down a long time ago, and there is a city that grows up near, and nobody knows that this used to be a huge tower. It looks like just glass fragments, kilometers of glass fragments. So this is a view from the airplane. At that time in the 80s, one of the very popular topics for competitions and discussions and symposiums was the year 2001. Sounds really amazing now, but I remember how far away was this mysterious year 2001. A lot of things were dedicated, even in 80s, to this year. So this was one of the competitions called the Monument to the year 2001. And we made a fragment of glass river the idea was that the number is nothing. The number 2001 doesn't mean anything, it's just a little piece of sand or a little point in the stream of time that has no beginning and no end. So we made this fragment based on 2001 column, and you can walk on the glass or you can walk underneath on the bottom, counting these columns. Almost, not everywhere, but sometimes we used very beautiful pieces of poetry of some poets, but it's not much time, not enough time to read it. This was the Museum of Sculpture, and we use stone sculpture as a symbol of stability, something that stays on its place for a long time, maybe forever. In this world where every minute everything is changing, nothing is stable, this is a little island of stability. One of the rare example of not Japanese competition, this was for British magazine AD, the doll's house. So we designed a little object for children's dolls, kind of structure in the room where children could play and keep all their toys. This was the Soviet Moscow competition, the only one that we made at that time, and it's important for us. So as I told you, all these projects were made in collaboration with my good friend Ilya Utkin, who is now a well-known architect in Moscow, has his own practice and builds beautiful houses. This was a moment when something really terrible started, not started, but was noticed by us. The process of disappearing of old buildings in the city. We lived in Moscow, and we were quite happy. We were young, and we thought everything is really fine. But suddenly, we started understanding that one by one, a very beautiful old building disappear. It's a process that goes on in every big city, in every country, of course. But for us, it was astonishing. It was really crazy to see how fast they started disappearing. The new ones appeared on their places, but the process of changing the historical center of the city was really bad and painful. That was in 80s, and since that time it goes faster and faster. So the whole areas in Moscow, really beautiful and precious architecture, disappears every day. So we designed a museum for disappearing buildings, a kind of columbarium, where people keep the ashes of their relatives, but this was made for buildings. So every little old building that was destroyed appeared as a model in the concrete niche in this museum with a little story, dates of birth and death, and a model. So we wanted to express how sad this process is, but it didn't help. And the last picture in this series is the version of the same project. We called it Columbarium Habitabile. So the difference is that